everyone to the next instalment of yet another exciting PropTech panel brought to you by the PropTech Association of Australia and its foundation sponsors Stone & Chalk, Ashurst Lawyers, Macquarie Bank, the Real Estate Institute of WA, PEXA and Webbit. My name is Scott Wilson. I'm a committee member of the PropTech Association of Australia, and this week we have a subject for you at the bleeding edge of debate across commercial real estate: data democracy. Where are the opportunities for data collaboration in commercial real estate? Before I begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, PropTech Association Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Many listeners will be well versed in the fundamentals. Australia's enormous stock of commercial real estate, $300 billion of investable assets and counting, has attracted a global investment audience and supported the professionalisation of commercial real estate. But as digital transformation agendas gather pace, the ripple effects on established work practices may mean what has worked in the past is not what will work in the future. And the accelerated adoption of technologies that make the difference will separate outperformers from the pack. These efforts are also likely to place data at the centre of new opportunities. And while there has been a broad enthusiasm in the ability of big data revolution to shake up the industry, so far there have yet to be significant shifts in established work practices. Joining us today to share their views on where the opportunity lies for the industry and how collaboration on data could be a win-win for commercial real estate professionals are Liam Murray, CEO of BuildApps, Simon Fontaine, Managing Director of Accurate, Chris Hanley, National Director, Head of New South Wales, Tenant Advisory Group for Cushman & Wakefield, and Stephen White, Energy Efficiency Domain Lender for CSIRO. So let's get into it. Starting with you, Simon, how does your solution, or how does your suite of solutions rather, improve collaboration in the commercial real estate industry?
Thanks, Scott. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And thank you for the PropTech panel for having me on. So our company, Leasing Information Systems, at the very heart of our modus operandi is data democracy. So for the last 15 years, we've been gathering data mainly in shopping centres and strips using whatever is available through public domain. So mainly through registered leases, but through gathering information, memorandums and other data to be able to share that across our network of landlords, tenants and investors. So that's really been the heart of the business. And more recently, we've combined with CSIRO's Data 61 to create the first machine learning tool called Accurate, which uses the smarts of Data 61 to be able to read leases and create structured data out of unstructured PDFs. All those tools combined create a platform for data democracy. However, I will state that up until today, we still face significant headwinds in achieving real available data across Australia. And those headwinds are mainly to do with regulatory issues. So not every state in Australia registers leases. Victoria doesn't. South Australia, Western Australia and Tasmania don't really either. And the other significant barrier is landlords, as a general rule, have confidentiality provisions in their lease, which creates a significant impediment to be able to achieving true data democracy.
Thanks, Simon. I'm sure we'll return to that shortly. Chris from Cushman & Wakefield, you're working closely with tenants on a regular basis. Which data sets help you in your role?
Yeah, so we've worked with Simon for a number of years to get lease information for some of our retail tenants, and that's been extremely helpful. There are other data sets that you can get access to for lease information across other asset classes as well, and those are very helpful just in terms of price discovery when you're trying to provide recommendations around what's a market deal look like, where are the opportunities for you to potentially get access to real estate if it's currently under lease, and those sort of things. We're also looking at other market data in terms of who's doing what in the market. That helps us in terms of understanding whether there might be some competition from other people that might be looking to potentially lease space that you've been speaking with another tenant about. And then other information, but because we're working with tenants, a lot of what we're trying to do is work out how much space they need and where should that space be. And so that then takes us into some other information. So occupier-based utilisation data. So how many people do they have visiting their locations at any one time? Where are those people coming from? And what's the travel time look like going from their place of residence to their place of work? And what does that look like if you're then moving them from one place to another? And again, the level of customization and the data that you start to lean on when you're looking at different industry types really starts to expand, because you need to start to get your head around what performance looks like for an occupier within a particular industry, and that can lead you down some rabbit holes into industry-specific data sets as well. So fortunately, there's plenty of information out there. It's just trying to decide which information you want to use to help create those insights that your tenants are looking to you for, and also whether or not that information is reliable.
Yeah, right. Some interesting points there. Thanks, Chris. Liam from Build Apps, your PropTech facilitates, sanitizes data flows between business applications. What examples can you share today where these data flows have led to improved outcomes?
Yeah, so I think the big focus is around the data democracy, not just being everybody having access to everything, but there's also a level of security around it. And what we're trying to get is clients to own their own data. And once they do that, they can then decide which departments within a big commercial real estate company can access which data sets. So obviously some of it is secure, some of it isn't, some of it can be cross-talked. So we've seen some great examples from, where traditionally the development team wouldn't normally talk to the operations procurement team. And from cross-layering data sets, they managed to identify they had $12 million worth of assets all from one manufacturer. And suddenly that meant the development arm could talk to that manufacturer and go, well, rather than us going around in circles. Other examples, the leasing team don't normally interact too much with the facilities maintenance teams in a traditional model, whereas we were able to see that certain lease types, so certain tenant types, created a lot more issues. And that was actually, from statistical information that was captured. And so, the tenants that had long hours, or particularly lawyers in large buildings, would tend to have more complaints because they were working in the evening when it was harder to get reliable. And that might affect system choices when you design. So cross-layering is quite important.
Yeah, right. Some interesting points there. Stephen from CSIRO. Where does CSIRO see the greatest potential for data collaboration in commercial real estate?
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so just in terms of my interests, so I'm not Data 61. I'm in the energy business unit, but we do collaborate really strongly with Data 61, and particularly their scaleups data streaming platform there. So my interest is in energy efficiency and also in integration of buildings into the electricity grid. The air conditioning system in buildings is responsible for almost a quarter of all electricity consumed. And as much as 50% of the peak demand days, and the security of the system is certainly influenced there. So So yeah, sort of opportunities in the energy space. We have data sets in the residential building space. So we got almost 1 million dwellings that got rated through the National Construction Code, and so we're custodians of data there through the regulatory process in the National Construction Code, and then we're sort of developing the sort of building automation technology and how do we actually create the ecosystem of innovation there. And I guess the opportunities that I'm really interested in is where does government sort of play a role in data infrastructure to enable that ecosystem of innovators and to sort of underpin markets. And so in the case of the NATA's data set that we've got, to what extent, it's been an ongoing conversation and presumably will come out the end of the sausage factory in due course, is disclosure of energy efficiency ratings in the market. And suddenly that then creates a bunch of secondary markets and potential for low interest loans. We've got at least one banking institution that is using the NATA's data set to underpin low interest loans and stuff. And so, what's the role of a trusted institution to manage data? And, the Open Data Institute talks about this concept of data institutions to be stewards of data. What's the role of that, of those kind of institutions, and how do they play in a way that that encourages competition and innovation, but doesn't sort of come in with heavy-handed government bureaucracy and stuff. So those are the kinds of things that we're tossing around as we have a whole bunch of data sets that unique data sets that come into us.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point there, Stephen. Thank you. Simon, you touched on this as well, so I'm going to jump straight to a question on this to you. What do you think government and regulators could do to facilitate further greater sharing and greater transparency in the marketplace for commercial real estate data? Yeah, sorry, Simon, you're on mute. There we go.
So can you hear me? Yeah. In 2008, the Productivity Commission actually looked at the whole sector of commercial real estate in the retail space, and they recommended that information in each state, at least enough to be able to form a view around the key details of a lease, be registered. Unfortunately, governments have actually not done anything about it since 2008, and it's really miles behind where it should be. In this day and age, where you can think that you can go to realestate.com.au or you can go to RP Data and get information about everything in a residential setting, but yet you can't find what are the leases in in High Point Shopping Centre or any other major shopping centre in Victoria. It's kind of a really archaic situation. Mind you, globally, we know we're actually probably more advanced than a lot of countries, because a lot of countries you can't get anything. So here there is the registration process, but it's not really providing that national footprint to be able to really do the type of work that, say, Chris, who's looking at things nationally, need to be able to do, to be able to look at a whole of country sort of situation. Now, without talking out of school, the main reason why governments and the whole industry as a general rule have not progressed this is because the commercial imperative is not there. So it's not in landlords' interest to really provide this information because there's it's commercial in confidence. And until such time as that information has been taken into the public domain, I don't see that actually changing. So it's really up to governments and regulators to be the custodians, as Stephen said, to make this available, to create further transparencies. And if that is available, then obviously there's a lot of economic benefits not only in terms of better decision making, but also being able to provide transparency to a market that's often shrouded in mystery.
That's an interesting point, Simon. I think that commercial imperative's a really interesting point. Just to tease that out a bit further, a question for you, Chris. What would greater collaboration on these sorts of things, if there was a national registry where leases were registered, what would that mean for how you do your job, and what would this mean for the tenants that you represent?
Yeah, well, just speaking to the retail context that Simon alluded to before, I mean, I know from my dealings with retail tenants in New South Wales, it's of great benefit having access to the volume of lease information that you can get because of the registration process here. So, applying that same process in other states would give national retailers or any tenants operating outside of New South Wales effectively greater control or greater understanding of what the context is that they operate within, and give them a greater ability to make decisions around lease renewals and that sort of thing, with that greater information to hand. And then similarly in the commercial context and in all property classes, that additional information would be to the benefit of the tenants. I think it'd also be to the benefit of smaller landlords as well. And, in a retail environment where you've got a dominant landlord or a sole landlord in control of 400 or so retail tenancies, it's effectively its own market. And so a situation where you've got a landlord having 100% of the information about all of the tenants, what they're paying, how much, what turnover they're doing, and the tenant potentially having zero information outside of their own lease, which is expiring anyway, I think, there's a big imbalance that could be tipped more towards the tenant's favour without significantly impacting the landlord. So I think there's certainly potential for that to happen, and it hasn't blown up the market in New South Wales. So, applying it in other states, I think would be a good thing. And in terms of other information, I think about the US, where the registration doesn't necessarily apply, but there is a greater level of sharing between the agent and broker community around availability information and deal information as well. And that certainly hasn't blown up the agent community over there either. I think it just takes what is essentially a very inefficient process at the start of the lease, where you're looking for buildings to put your tenants into, and it just condenses that, because you can go to one location and find all of the availability information you need, rather than having to run a process whereby you're effectively contacting every agent that is active in the market you're searching in to try and understand whether or not there is any availabilities that suit your client's requirements. So more collaboration, I think, is better for the industry. I think it's going to lead to a more efficient industry, and probably one that's a little bit more balanced between landlords and tenants. But certainly, I think our view is that this sort of greater collaboration is certainly coming. So we just need to prepare ourselves for, how we participate in that.
Yeah, that's great. That's an interesting point around the New South Wales. Maybe we can return to that subject soon, around those state-based disparities based on practices that take place. Question for you, Liam. We're sort of hearing here the industry approaches the position around data collaboration from a position of fear, and this is based on those asymmetry positions that exist in those markets that can exist where you've got those disparate information flows. What do you think can be done to switch that perspective around from a position of fear and protection to one of openness and collaboration?
Yeah, I think it's feeding the information back to the property owners at times. What tends to happen is quite often it'll be done with one platform or an external consultant, and that never gets centralized back to the property owner, who can then share that with who they want to share with. So it's not necessarily, somebody being the custodian of it. And there will be times when they don't want to share it because it's commercially sensitive, or their offering in a lease is very intricate. And so it can't be compared apples with apples. But at least if they're storing in a common schema, and then they can pass that out to somebody else and they can understand that schema, they can choose to share. Whereas at the minute when they do share it, it's a PDF of an offering to another PDF of an offering. Whereas if the owner of the building becomes the owner of the information and treats it the same as their bricks and mortar, and then passes it out in a nice structured way, there'd be efficiencies for everyone.
Yeah, just a follow-on question for this, and it sort of begs the question about the skill sets, I guess, that would need to exist in the industry. You know, it's something I see a little bit of, where traditionally professionalisation of commercial real estate hasn't necessarily always led to real estate owners having a lot of competency and skill sets in the business around this. So what do you think a greater collaboration environment would look like around how landlords, how owners, and how other service providers in the industry would need to recruit and attract talent, and what sort of roles that they would need to be looking for?
So yeah, it's probably having a common schema that everybody knows they can work to, and then those skill sets can start to emerge around that, and that where that schema crosses everything, so covers leases, covers asset management, covers sustainability and efficiency, covers facilities management. It's if everybody's storing their information in a similar way, then people can start to really specialize. Whereas at the minute we've got software as a service vendors doing one thing in one direction, and then we've also got some of the big REITs trying to do in-house software development, which no one can then tap into because they can't see how it's built. So trying to meet in the middle so that everyone can share information, because the last thing people want to do is spend endless amount of time trying to digest, like building custom APIs every single time for information. Costs time and money.
Yeah, okay. So a common schema, a common way of, or a common language to work with these information flows. Interesting point. So I guess related to that is probably a question for you, Stephen. What examples can you identify in your work where collaboration has led to joint benefits for its participants? You know, you sort of mentioned some of those open data projects. I'd be really interested in your take on where you've seen some wins here.
Yeah, well, a lot of the projects that I get involved in the sort of environmental sort of space have got some sort of underpinning government scheme that creates value. So something like Neighbours, for example, for energy ratings there, by actually kind of having an ecosystem around that, the building owners get their rating, asset values go up for the higher rated buildings. And there's a value proposition for upgrading the performance of buildings that then get sort of contracted out through players. So you know, the NatHERS scheme that's in the residential space that I talked about before, that's all based off National Construction Code that then sort of triggers a bunch of things. Neighbours or the Green Building Council with their Green Star rating schemes and things, you know, they drive an ecosystem of collaboration there, but it's all sort of centered around someone who's the custodian of the scheme, and custodian of the scheme being custodian of data.
Yeah, interesting point. So we're sort of talking around the constraints and also some of the opportunities. Where do, I guess, CSIRO and some of the work you're doing at the moment help to, I guess, add to this kind of common language of the data that's available? Have you got any projects that you're working on at the moment that work on this?
So in our building automation space, you know, we're certainly trying to champion structuring of data, and so, you know, with HVAC equipment, you know, that's the stuff that's, you know, the chillers and the valves and all that sort of stuff. You know, using the brick schema as an ontology that sort of structures things up, and you know, our aspiration, I guess, is to sort of head towards something that looks like a no customization tool. You know, and to make it easy, you know, how do we get scalability through our mobile phone? And the apps that run off that is, you've got you know, one app, you download it, you use it, kind of thing, and there is no human intervention. And we've kind of got this mindset in the industry that every building's a prototype, and I've heard that said a number of times. And somehow or other, to get scalability in this industry, we actually have to structure up the data so that you can almost have that kind a mindset of click, install, then use, and you don't actually have to go back and sort of bring in the experts, because every time you put someone on premises, you know, you're chewing up a lot of transaction cost. And ultimately, in my game, energy is a commodity product. There's not a lot of fat to be had there.
Yeah, fascinating. Simon, returning to you, can you think of some examples you've seen perhaps in your endeavours outside of Australia as well, where some of the tools that are used in your suite of products are in use, and what that's meant for the industries offshore and how they've developed?
Yeah, so Chris made a good point about the US. So in the US, they have a company called CoStar, which bought LoopNet. Even though they don't register leases in the US, or some states, I believe they might do, but the broker network has a very sort of they have a sharing mindset. So the way it works over there is that the brokers are incentivized to put data in, because they're the ones doing the deals, and they get an incentive in terms of getting data back through either a reduction in subscriptions or that they get benefits. And so that's how it's done in the US. In the UK, they have different laws around. In the UK, you've got automatic right of renewal on a lease, and they do have a sort of data collaboration tool there. The main differences between the US and us is that in Australia, the majority of leases have a commercial in confidence provision, and those things tend to be enforced. The other thing is, in Australia, particularly in retail, which is my sector, the majority of the agents don't operate in the larger shopping centres. They tend to be owner managed, and the REITs are, you know, not really incentivized to provide that information because they use that for their commercial leverage. So I don't see that as something that's directly comparable. However, where I do see there are opportunities to work is more around de-identified data. So kind of what Urbis is a benchmarking tool. I'm sure you've all heard of it. They take de-identified data from the landlords mainly, and then they provide benchmarks. We have a project on at the moment, which we're working with a few groups about doing something similar. So providing data using collaboration tools to be able to provide benchmarks which don't breach anybody's confidentiality, but yet provide information around, you know, what are some of the key benchmarks in data that in places that are hitherto unavailable in terms of information. So I see that continuing to progress. I see that sort of benchmarking piece continuing to gather pace until such time as, well, all this information becomes available. And I think it's almost inevitable that it will, because we're moving to electronic data interchange. So for example, in New South Wales from 1 August, there's new legislation that requires leases to be automatically digitally registered and signed. So that's going to create opportunities to digitally, read that information and make that more available. And I just see that happening more and more around in, other sort of registries around the country. So I think it's only a matter of time. It might take a decade or so. It might be, it might be quicker, but it's inevitable that this information will become available, whether people like it or not. That it just will, because There's too many ways now in which that information can be shared. And to be honest with you, as Chris said, New South Wales has had registration for years. It hasn't collapsed the market. In actual fact, New South Wales has the strongest commercial real estate market in the country. It just provides more transparency. There's significant economic benefits. So, it's really just a matter of time before other places follow suit. But it may not be in the same format as New South Wales. There may be other ways in which it's done, but inevitably it will happen.
Yeah, interesting point. Returning to you, Liam, how do you think from an owner's perspective that real estate owners can position themselves to take advantage of improvement in data availability? If as Simon's describing, it's just a matter of time. What actions do you think big owners, landlords can take now to begin preparing for that future?
I think, with the boom of prop tech, and it's having a clear onboarding strategy, we're seeing lots of these big companies, doing lots of prop tech in different directions, and it's not creating a common data model. It's scattering the information even further away from where it needs to be. So having that process, and we kind of talk to everyone about, no matter what it is, what you sign up to, you need to make sure you know the what, the when, the who, and the how the data is being accessed. So that they can understand, is this being unsold? Is the data that I'm giving to you being unsold? There's lots of metering companies who are SaaS based, who their revenue is based on selling that meter data to third party, but the owners of the property who bought the meter and run the meter, they haven't given anyone permission to do that. It's just they're just deeming it's their data and they can sell it. Whereas, having those declarations up front, and quite often we've seen some fantastic stuff with manufacturers putting IoT devices inside their units so that they can get telemetry on how their units are performing. And some of our big clients have been like, fantastic, you have the data, because if you improve your product, we get a better outcome as a client, but you have to tell us you're doing it. You can't just, it's my data, I'm going to do something else with it and not let you know. The owner of the data is the owner of the building, is my take on it.
Yeah, interesting point. I guess it's a really interesting one, and perhaps for those prop tech listeners out there, a relevant question, because the SaaS business model is a pretty popular one. It's quite an effective one as well, and certainly encourages, in the right setting, the right incentives and alignment behind it. But how do you think that prop techs can really aim to achieve a balance between suiting and designing their onboarding for landlord customers with the appetite that's needed for actually moving fast and breaking things? We've seen a lot of adoption. We'll see a lot more in the years to come. How do you think prop tech should position themselves to really balance the kind of what can probably feel like competing requirements between groups at times?
I think being API centric. So the days of you having a nice dashboard and people buying a product because you've got a nice dashboard are long gone. Like, all of our clients have got data analysts in-house. They've got Power BI, they've got Tableau. They can make any dashboard they want. They want to API to consume your data. And those, the prop tech companies need to have faith in what they do with the data and their unique IP of how they manipulate it, whatever their model is, to give they ingest, do something smart, send it back. They need to have faith in what they actually do is the value, not the hoarding the data. It's, have faith in what you're doing with the information is the value.
Yeah, right. So the special source, being clear about what your special source is, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Interesting point. Returning to you, Chris, what are there data sets that don't exist yet which would transform what you do?
Yes, I've just been thinking about that a little bit more, and trying to compare the different industries in commercial real estate. And in retail, you've got turnover data that is a really good indicator of the suitability of a particular site to the product that you're trying to retail out of it. And in the commercial space, it's not as clear what the impact of the location is on the performance of the business. And so if there was a really, well-defined metric that we could point to that kind of identified the overall commercial impact of a location in the commercial office context, that would be really helpful, but it's kind of hard, you know, that's sort of nirvana. Other sorts of information that I think would be amazing would be utilisation information for commercial office buildings. So particularly in this sort of post-COVID landscape, people are really trying to understand how their buildings are being used, and there's a range of different ways that you can determine how your buildings are being used, but that lack of standardization makes it very difficult to sort of compare one building to another, and you know what that information really means when you're looking at two different data sets. So one might be race gate swipe-ins, whereas another might be a richer data set to do with how long people are sitting in individual chairs. And so, you know, some sort of standardization or a standard data set around building utilization, I think would be extremely handy, and it'd give you an ability to compare one building to another in terms of their carrying capacity. You know, what's the impact in terms of tenant experience with a high volume building versus a low volume building, or a low population building, I should say. That would be really good, because ultimately we're trying to find, you know, what is the best place for our client to locate themselves within. You know, the commercials, the rent, the incentives, those sort of things, they're good to know in terms of buying the product at the start, but then, you know, there's a commitment for 5, 7, 10 or even longer that, you know, you really need to understand before you go in, and those sort of metrics would be very helpful in terms of determining what's the right spot for the client. So, you know, I think that would be very handy. How we get there, I'm not sure, but we'll leave that to the big brains out there, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess just returning to some points Simon was making before about the benchmark data he's working on. He used the Urbis example, and then some work that he's involved in at the moment around, you know, furthering some of that benchmark analysis that could be available. If that sort of information were available out there, how would that help you? Would that start to fill some of that void around utilisation potentially? Would it potentially make it easier and get better outcomes for how those lease renewals or new leases and take up, and maybe even shorten the cycle for renewal? Would it make a difference for you?
Potentially. I think the benchmarks that Simon's referring to are sort of looking at different categories of retail shopping centres, and then looking at different rental profiles for different industries that operate within those types of shopping centres. And I haven't poured through the data set in great detail recently, but from what I recall, you know, I'm not sure how transferable that analysis could be into the commercial office context, because of the, you know, the different things that you're considering when you're looking at a retail shop versus a commercial office. But yeah, look, any sort of market-wide or industry-wide benchmarking is always going to be relevant, and give you an ability to sort of benchmark your own occupancy costs from the client's perspective, their occupancy costs versus their peers. And, you know, we certainly try to provide analysis to that effect as part of our recommendations to our clients. But again, if that analysis was available at a market level and for purchase, then that would give us more time to spend analysing other things for our clients. So again, yeah, that would save us time. A lot of these emerging sort of data sets and subscriptions that you can get access to really just take time away from work that we're already doing, and allow us to focus on stuff that is a lot more customised to the individual tenant. And so, yeah, look, that it'd all be great. More data is more helpful for all of our clients and ourselves. It just takes time out of it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Chris. Question for you, Stephen, and I told you I'd be asking you this question. If you had a magic wand, what single change would you make, and why?
Yeah, well, obviously, I'm going to sort of pitch what I'm doing in the space when you ask me a question like that. So, so just to sort of build up the pitch, shall we say? You know, ultimately, you know, this data democratization is indeed what we're sort of searching for, and ultimately, that sort of comes down to data platforms that actually enable the data democratization. And so, what would a data platform do? We talked about you know, semantic web technologies and structuring up data. So, you know, creating context to data is really important. Federating multiple data sets, and when you've got context and you've got federation of data, then you can start to apply artificial intelligence and do the smart things. And obviously in my CSIRO world, I'll get off on sort of doing the smarts over the top. But unless the data has got context, unless it's federated with a whole bunch of other data sets, I can't really do that. So in my world, I would sort of pitch to the data hoarders, the people who got their sort of holding on tightly to their data sets. I'd say, well, no, if we collaborate around some sort of data platform, then we can do a whole lot more interesting things than we otherwise would have. But at the same time, having to deal with the data fearers in this world, who quite rightly are worried about access controls, and we've had a good discussion around that. And so a lot of the sort of business model stuff that needs to actually think really hard about access controls and data governance kind of issues. So, from a pitching point of view, at least in the HVAC air conditioning space, we're building up what we call in the data clearinghouse, and we see it as a bit of a data institution that is stewarding data on behalf of the industry for the industry, and that kind of intervention there, where a trusted, not-for-profit type arrangement to actually liberate data and enable the smarts to be used, and competition around who can provide really good value-added services. So that's my kind of wish list. Long journey to get there, of course.
Yeah. So that federation, establishing the context, the federation, the commonality, creating a platform that is, sort of spans beyond, I guess, sort of HVAC into the broader sphere of what is commercial property.
And the ability to have a rich discussion, in my energy world, we have fault detection and diagnosis and tools like that. And purely from an energy efficiency point of view, they have payback times less than 2 years. And yet it's not a widespread practice, probably starting to gain a bit of traction now, but hasn't been a widespread practice. And a lot of that is, to do with trust, around the data, about information asymmetry, the fact that, if I engage in this industry, I don't understand it properly. Where can I go to sort of have someone to navigate the complexity of this with me? And how do I avoid getting sort of locked into someone's commercial ecosystem? All those kind of things have prevented what is otherwise greenhouse gas emissions saving, low-hanging fruit from a high financial return. So it's really important stuff, this data democracy, to enabling these important environmental and economic benefits.
Stephen, are you suggesting there could be a role for a data utility that can enforce this?
Yeah, well, so that's the interesting thing to me. When we built up the electricity industry, we realized that that the poles and wires, you don't sort of build poles and wires multiple times down your road. You actually have to share a resource there before you can actually provide any electricity. And so I sort of, in my philosophical world anyway, sort of say, well, what is the role for common good data infrastructure? And government understands, that we build roads so that cars can drive down them. Do we need to actually build up data infrastructure? I don't think it's the solution for everything, but I certainly see a role in some instances where there's demonstrated sort of market failure.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. Look, I've got some other questions, but we've had some excellent questions from the audience that I might just jump over to so that I can cover them all in the time we have remaining. The first one's for you, Liam. If the building owner owns the data, in your opinion, how is this handled when executing transfer of ownership?
Yeah, so one of our big ROIs that we kind of talk about our platform or our ecosystem as such is that we've directly seen it firsthand. When a client bought a building, there was only 7 people who bid on it. When they come to sell it, and they put into the data room so much information because they had so much information and were very transparent, and they had 30 plus bids, and it was only an 18-month period later. So the market had changed. But when you sell a building, the more information you provide, the more judgment on the risk the purchasers are going to do. So it's not just, it's not just that matter of, you're not going to sell a building with none of that data. If you've got it, you put it on show and you get a higher value for your building when you come to transact.
Okay. Yeah, follow-on question for that. And I know this is an area potentially you've looked at before. How has BIM contributed to making progress to solving the common schema that you talk about?
So BIM traditionally has sat at the front end and has been kind of new build designer led. And given, I can't remember the stat, but I think it's 80% of all buildings currently built are still going to be here in 30 years' time. So there's not going to be magic BIM models of all the stuff that's already built. So the focus not on the geospatial aspect of BIM, but I always say in BIM, the I becomes before the M. So the information is more important than the model. So getting the information to move through. Whereas I've been involved in so many projects where they've had a BIM model for coordination, and then the information from it has never even created an asset register, which is just criminal, but it's not seen as a whole of life cycle thing. It's seen for coordination, and trying to change that to help. It does help massively having IFCs and the role that Kobe and Building Smart do globally are really powerful too. But then there's still, Stephen mentioned Haystack, being able to translate from IFC to Haystack, and then across to, there's endless amounts of different schemas. Being able to translate quickly between those is what we're trying to help people do, so that there is a commonality. You've not got, it called an air handling unit in there and then called, a fan coil unit in the other system, and they can't understand we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, sure. Do you feel it's like water? It's the data is like water. It's kind of inevitably going to find the lowest point and find a way through. Do you think that it's just a matter of time before a lot of initiatives around better use of data, better collection, storage, transferability of it is going to happen? Or do you feel like the impediments in the way right now are going to make that slower than we think?
I think it's getting slower and slower. I think there's more people introducing to use your water. There's people putting oil in here. There's people putting alcohol in here. There's people putting, so they're all making it harder to mix. That's what's it called? And that's, people have got slightly different vested interests, if that makes sense. Certain people want a data set for what they want. Certain people want a data set for what they want. And that's the only commonality in our view, is the owner of the building. And that's why I bring it back to the owner, and then he can pass it to, he can pass the leases if he wants to share that piece. He can pass the BMS data to somebody who wants to do something smart. It's their choice where it flows. What flows. That's a good analogy, actually.
Cool. Thanks, Liam. Next question, I'll throw this one to you, Simon. Has anyone quantified the economic benefits in opening the lease data through a registry?
Well, that was actually quantified in the Productivity Commission report. You can look at it in 2008. So we did a whole lot of analysis of the benefits of having information, including things like information asymmetry, better economic outcomes from both landlords and retailers. So that's all there. Just look at the Productivity Commission report. I would say, just as a corollary to the benefits, I think one of the things that we as a group have to realize is that we're really only at the infancy of what data can be used for. And, having the CSIRO Data 61 in our offices, we started on a project to use AI, not just to read leases, but to make better intelligent decisions. And what's actually available and what can be sourced and gleaned from correlations that, the average professional, and I've been in this industry for most of my career, I would not have thought or even realized that these correlations exist. It's actually mind-blowing. So the imperatives are not only from a transparency point of view, but it's going to become a situation where probably in, I can't put a time frame on it, but investment decisions, relocation decisions are going to need this sort of data to actually work. So it's becoming like that, where, you know, other industries like, for example, medical or finance, engineering, that this data is sort of available already. And so it's only a matter of time before the commercial real estate either catches up or is forced to catch up. And, you know, Chris, who works for a number of banks, the banks may refuse at some point in time to actually sign off on things if they don't have this data. I mean, I can see that coming. You know, they won't get their approval. So, you know, it's almost becoming a necessity where there's going to need to be more information. And unfortunately, you know, the governments have really been they haven't wanted to step in. And by the way, governments hold a huge amount of their own data in this space, and they haven't released it either. So they're just as bad as not facilitating this. So it will happen. It's just a matter of time, but I can't put a time frame on it.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think, you know, you mentioned the banks, and increasingly they're going to require it. I'm interested in your view around what you think would be the effects of banks using more data for decision-making purposes, and what it could look like for their work practices outside of direct property work practices.
Well, I mean, Chris would probably be able to talk more, but for example, you have AVMs, which stands for automated valuation models. I can see the time where a bank who's particularly a big facilitator of real estate won't make a decision unless they've got 50 or 60 data points spanning across my set, Liam's set, and Stephen's set. They need that to be able to, a big data set to work out, okay, if I'm going to invest $20 million in opening a branch, or not a branch, but say a major, you know, retail/commercial facility, I need all this data to be able to make a decision. And if I don't have it, I can't make it. So you provide it, or we'll go somewhere else where they can provide it. So it's becoming like that, you know, the big data sets you know, are becoming ubiquitous. You just have to look at a company like Quantium, which is mining, you know, very, very large data sets, not necessarily yet in the commercial space, but it's only a commercial office space, but it's only a matter of time where these things will be required to make decisions. Because professional, and we talked about the professionalisation of the real estate sector, the majority of people who work traditionally in the real estate sector are trained in either in land economics, accounting, finance. They're not trained in data science. So they need support from data scientists who normally sit under the professionals like Chris or myself, but they will be increasingly saying, well, I can't give you a sign off unless I have this data. So that's where I see this going. It's been only recent where I've had the CSIRO in my own office, and I can see what they can do. But it's really opened my eyes to say, wow, this is what's coming. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Yeah, okay. Chris, would you have anything further to add to that?
Yeah, I think Simon's right. Like it's really hard to ascertain whether or not a relocation from one space to another has been a good move or is likely to be a good move when you're only working with limited data sets. So, you know, if all of a sudden there's this ability to tie together different data sets to demonstrate the validity of a move from one spot to another, I think if that starts to emerge, then you're right, it's going to become a requirement in order to support the deal to demonstrate that it is going to have a positive benefit to the business. So, you know, that data set's not available at the moment, and often our recommendations will include some reference to whether or not the deal looks like a good deal in the context of the market, so that the commercials stack up. You know, there might be questions around, have we investigated what the impact is on the staff in terms of travel time or employee experience or those sort of things? But certainly if there was a broader data set that was able to demonstrate whether or not previous decisions were successful or not, that would also be great for identifying whether or not relocations or renewals in current offices were the right decision. And yeah, I mean, if that data set was available, it would be compulsory, or it should ought to be.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. We've probably got time for one more question each. I'll start with you, Stephen. What would it mean? You know, you're leading some of the work that Simon was introducing around AI, and you know, when you're working with big data sets that you're privy to, are you excited by the opportunities that AI present for commercial real estate?
Yeah, totally. And you know, I think from my point of view, you know, there are so many different application domains, and you know, I'm really passionate about sort of occupant-centric utilization of AI, you know, the success of doing AI and things like that to me is around the sort of the richness of the dialogue of what we can do. You know, if it was purely about energy, you know, energy obviously is my passion. You know, there's a certain number of things we can do with AI, but when we get to comfort, productivity, and you know, asset utilization and all these things that we've talked about today, it's then you're starting to sort of bundle lots of value propositions together, and that's when you know, I think that we'll see it happening. And the difficulty, of course, is you know, individual siloed providers, sort of just with one little application that they do. It's not a very rich conversation. Difficult to get value out of the AI there. So that collaboration and partnership around data is important for the future of AI, I think, in the commercial building sector.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Last one for you, Liam. Magic wand question I asked Stephen before. What would, you know, you're a magician, you've got a magic wand, what you're waving it around, what's your single wish around what one thing you could change?
Probably, yeah, if everyone adopted a common data model, and there are various parties around the world. We've been working with Microsoft and RICS in the UK and different parties, but everyone coming together so that we go, right, here's 500 tables and 20,000 fields, and they'll all be called this. And whether that's making an offer for a lease with all the different terms in it, whether it's a data set that needs to go to Stephen's crew, whether it's there, that everyone just agrees on a common schema for all commercial real estate. And it is possible. We're covering lots of sectors, and you just don't use some of it when it's healthcare, and you don't use some of it when it's retail, and you don't use some of it when it's office. But it can all live in the same common data model schema.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Liam. Simon, magic wand, what's your answer?
Well, if I had a magic wand, I'd love to be able to get registration in every state. That would be my number one. If I could achieve that before the end of my career, you know, I would be very, very, I think it would be great for the industry. You know, so that would be my number one thing. In terms of where the magic wand, though, sometimes you know, there is a lot of things that can become redundant. So my concern is, and Chris touched on this, is the sector is actually quite inefficient in the way that things are managed. So that AI has the power to actually make things much, much more efficient. But it also has the power to actually make a lot of processes redundant. So, you know, and there has to be, you know, thought around how to use AI and data democracy to basically benefit not only the whole sector, but those people who work in it as well.
Awesome. Yeah. And Chris, magic wand?
Yeah, I think for me, ultimately, I'd love to be able to get access to a data set that helped demonstrate whether or not a relocation from one site to another would be to the benefit of the business that I'm working with. So, you know, some sort of aggregation of different data points that kind of gave me a tick in a box or not, that would be ideal. It'll probably do me out of a job, but yeah, look, it'd be very handy, because yeah, often we get caught up trying to make recommendations to clients, and it could be that there's a couple of different options that could work for them, but I'd love to be able to have a really concrete indicator that I could point to that said, look, you know, there's an AI platform that's analysed these 20 different data points, and it's recommending that you proceed with this transaction, and it's right more often than it's not. So if that existed, that would make my job a lot easier, but I probably have a bit too much time on my hands if that existed.
Thank you, Chris. That's all we have time for today. Special thank you to Stone & Chalk, who have made today possible. Stone & Chalk are Australia's leader in connecting founders, investors and industry stakeholders, and they're home to more than 20 of Australia's pioneering PropTech. So a special thank you to Samantha and Stone & Chalk for making today happen. Thank you as well to the PropTech Association of Australia, and thank you to all our panelists, Simon Fontaine, Liam Murray, Chris Hanley and Stephen White. Thank you.